Hi everyone, welcome to Everything Dog Training Podcast. I'm John McGuigan, Glasgow dog trainer and behaviour consultant. Welcome back if you're a return listener, and if you're listening to us for the first time, we really appreciate you taking a chance on us, and hopefully you'll find this information useful, beneficial and applicable to your life with your dog. A couple of things, how we can help you. We do a broad range of education, so we do have one-to-one practice in Glasgow. So if you're in the Glasgow area or fancy travelling to the Glasgow area in Scotland, then please do get in touch. You can email me info@glasgowdogtrainer.co.uk. You can also use that email address to get in touch with me for anything at all to do with dog training. So if you've got some feedback on the podcast, we always like hearing from you. If you're interested in coming on as a guest, that's how you'll contact me. And if you want to tell us how wonderful the podcast is, then that's the way to do it. You can also get us on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Glasgow Dog Trainer. And we do a variety of online courses. I'll link we've got a podcast discount code which I'll put in the bio for this one. And you get 10% off some of our courses. And you can also reach out to us if you need help with your dog and you're not, what's the word I'm looking for? You're not local to Glasgow, so you're slightly more remote. So we offer, we do one-to-one consultations remotely as well, and we've done them all across the world. So we set up an online call, go through your problems and coach you that way, and then there's further support that we can give you that way as well. So please do get in touch with us. So today's guest is Leeron Liftik. Leeron Liftik, CPDT, CBCC, PDT, and he is a dog trainer and behaviour consultant in California, in Northern California, and does a ton of work with shelter dogs, and that's where loads of his experiences come from. I don't know if you can hear that my son's playing a guitar in the other room, so the microphone might be able to pick it up very slightly in the background, if you think, rather than it's been new music I've put on. He's practicing a new Pearl Jam song that he's learning. It's not a new Pearl Jam song, it's an old Pearl Jam song, but it's new to him. So Leeron has said, dogs are dogs, let them be that. The area that he is called on most frequently to support is helping medium and high drive personality working breeds to integrate into companion level homes. His approach is creating change at the emotional level to impact behaviours informed by the resilience conditioning framework. By focusing on holistically meeting the animal's needs from an integrative platform, any maladaptive coping mechanisms inherently become obsolete. He maintains speciality in treating fear-based behaviours, aggression, separation-related behaviours and gestational development for puppies. He works with dogs from all sorts of backgrounds, but far and away has most experience with shelter and rescue animals, and they are his preferred population. We had a great chat. It was, and I know I say this a lot. Whether I don't know, something's going right with who we're picking on as guests, and I'm also learning how to interview people better as well. So, but we're getting good guests on. I've enjoyed every single one of my conversations so far, and this one was great. If you're listening to this and you're relatively new, we do get kind of geeky about it for the first part of it, probably the first 2/3 of the hour, or I think we run just over an hour for this one. Don't let the jargon put you off. We've got lots of applicable stuff at the end and the last 10-15 minutes on how to, if you've rehomed or just adopted an adult dog, and especially one that's been in a shelter environment for a long time, there's lots of applicable information in the last part of the podcast. So you can either skip to that or you can just hopefully listen to the full thing, but don't let we get a wee bit geeky and technical in the first part of the podcast, so please don't let that put you off. One of the things that I'll do when I'm interviewing somebody is I'm aware that there's a broad range of listeners, from first time dog parents or guardians to people like myself who are full-time in the industry working, and Leeron full-time in the industry working with these cases, and everybody in between. Sometimes what can happen when two geeks like Leeron and myself get together is that we geek out and we start getting super into a lot of the technical detail. And although we're having a good conversation, it might not be accessible to everybody else, and that's usually when I'll interrupt and ask to expand a little bit further. But Leeron a couple of times was in flow, and I didn't want to interrupt him. So the few he talks about stim in relation to a shock collar. That's a euphemism. Okay, that's basically shocking the dog. Okay, the people that will say they stim the dog, and that's applying shock. Okay, that's applying electricity to the dog's neck. Okay, so when he refers to stim, that's what he's referring to there. And a couple of times he refers to P plus and P minus, and that's positive punishment and negative punishment, which are scientific terms, which I either have or will talk about again in the future. All right, but really nice conversation. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll catch you on the other side. Welcome, Leeron. Thanks for taking time out your schedule to join us today. So, whereabouts are you in the world?
I'm in Northern California, Nevada City.
Okay, how far from that is from Sacramento or San Francisco?
Oh, we're about a little over an hour from Sacramento, couple 2.5 hours from the Bay Area.
Further north?
Further east.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
The bit of California that everybody forgets about.
That's right. Everyone thinks, oh, you're from Nevada. No, Nevada City, actually. It's right next to Grass Valley, kind of in the middle of nowhere. You have to be going somewhere or coming from somewhere to come here.
Okay. What's the population where you are, the city, in Nevada City?
It's about 12,000 people.
Okay, okay. So how did you get into dog training? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So, I started, this was 16 years ago. And I was doing some community service, and I had the option to select from various types of community service. And I was like, oh, I'll go walk dogs at the local shelter. And so my journey with dog training started by being a volunteer at my local animal shelter, walking dogs.
Oh, wow. Okay. And you got the bug from there, I take it?
I did. I got the bug from there. I was immediately struck by how other volunteers around me were asking about like, oh, who did you train with? How do you know how to do this? And I have had two dogs and at the time, and I didn't believe I had any special insights. And so it was only through really the reflections of others that I was like, oh, I wonder if I'm good at this.
Yeah.
And of course, in in the shelter world, interest is very, very valuable. And so if you have the interest and the wherewithal, they will put you to work. They'll put you to charge.
What
and I
were
was, yeah.
what were those people seeing that made them think that, and I'm not saying that you didn't know what you were talking about. So what did they see that drew their attention?
Yeah. At the time, I think it was my dumb confidence,
Okay.
my underinformed confidence that I knew what I was doing and that I was willing to try.
Yeah.
When I reflect back on it, because I often ask myself that, and especially when I reflect on what I was doing and what my knowledge set looked like back then compared to now, I was like, how did I get that reflection? But I think it was just because I was really confident, I was really committed. I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so in many ways that empowered me to like believe that everything was okay. And even when it wasn't okay, and I was getting that kind of feedback clearly from the animal I was working with, my confidence overrode that for a period of time until I realized like, hey, there's something else going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would attribute it to just like my confidence and willingness, the fact that I would get in with dogs that had a dangerous history or whatever.
Had you always trained positively?
No, not at all. I thought that the carrot and the stick was obviously the best thing to do. Why not use both mechanisms? And I ended up with a dog who taught me exactly why you don't use those both mechanisms.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, Brady is the reason that I do this. And Brady was he was an English bulldog.
Okay.
And he had some behavioral stuff. He came from, he had some behavioral stuff in his background. And he was a dog who had a very high need for agency. He was extremely confident and self-assured. And he was a dog that just did not have quit in him. He just didn't have that. Um, and, other dogs I had worked with, or I had in my life, they did. It did seem to work. And without knowing what to look for, looking very myopically at the consequences, I was like, oh, this is working. Look, he stopped,
Yeah.
or they stopped. And Brady just didn't have that quit in him. And at the time, this was some time ago. This was before I started walking at the shelters. It was like 20 years ago. My life looked very different, and I was really motivated by financial gain at that point and the resources that that could provide you. And so I just figured, well, I'll just hire the most expensive celebrity dog trainer that I can find, and we're going to get this thing fixed because I have that resource. And the person I hired is really, really famous. Just told me point blank, like there's a level that he will submit at. You just need to keep increasing the intensity of the punishment.
Yeah.
And I didn't know any better, and I was paying many thousands of dollars for this advice, like $6,000, $7,000. Um, and Brady taught me that that was not true. After I endured many bites that sent me to the emergency room, and just kept on with it and trying to add protection so that I could continue to abuse him, which was
Yeah.
what was happening, under the counsel of this very noteworthy and expensive dog trainer. And the third time I had a pretty severe bite. Like I have a lot of stitches,
Yeah.
and a big scar from it. And it was at that point that I said, you know what? Forget this. This has never felt right. I
Yeah.
don't want to hurt my dog. I don't want to feel frustration in my relationship with him. I don't want to be responsible for the burden of every one of his choices, correcting it. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. It's such a burden for me. And so I said, okay, enough of this. What am I going to do? And when it came down to it, it was like, well, I can kill him
Yeah.
or I can figure out a better way.
Yeah.
And I figured out a better way, and I got online and got some clicker training, just like the $19, hey, teach your dog like the celebrities teach, whatever marketing thing caught me in. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as I added in a reward system and some practice, I never had an issue with that dog again.
Yeah.
And I remember very clearly thinking, boy, I've been fleeced this whole
Yeah.
time. I've lived 7 years with this dog who I love so much, and I could never get him to stop being mean to me, attacking me.
Yeah.
Um, and when I started to say, oh, well, instead of reaching for your collar to issue you a pop, I'm going to reach for my pocket to give you some cheese.
Yeah.
The immediate, and I know that this isn't for every dog. I'm
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
well aware that this is a unique case, but this is what educated me. In that moment, we had a 180-degree transformation in my relationship. And he showed me that there are some dogs out there that will not submit. They will not learn through the use of intentional discomfort,
Yeah.
and that rewards are the way. And that's stuck with me, and it's never left me. I've just kept seeking the people who are to get educated by the people who are getting results without using discomfort, initially as an ethical standpoint, but eventually and currently as just a matter of efficient outcomes.
Yeah. What's interesting about that story when you tell it is that I'm not laughing at the severity of it, right, at all. I have to check myself because sometimes I'm entertained by my own thoughts, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
what's interesting about that is that your feedback loop is this is causing me pain, right? That's your feedback loop. He'd bitten you 3 times severely, but something was overriding it, and it was this other information that you've got. So, despite the fact that evolution is telling you, stop doing this. This is causing, I mean, because you were, what was that? So subjected to, you're being subjected to aversive, unpleasant, painful experiences, but still continuing your behavior. And then so is he. It's
Yes,
crazy, isn't it?
it really is, and it's crazier because that's just where this study and pursuit has gone. It's so much more about teaching the human now
Yeah.
and understanding the specific dynamics between the dog's behavior and the human's resource. That's so much part of it. And it is that. It is that. That's one of the reasons when I started this work, I started under intuitive, because it's like some of this stuff isn't so complicated. When your dog looks upset, they're upset. That's it. You don't
Yeah.
address anger with more anger, do
Yeah.
you? Right?
Yeah.
It's just these are just fundamental understandings that as human beings, we have the capacity for empathy, which is one of the unique qualities of our species. And so you don't need to get so caught up in the headiness of this, which
Yeah.
of course I am as caught up in the headiness of this as possible, being a graduate student. Um, and yet the simplicity of it is what I constantly return to. And much like what you said, like I was conditioned and taught by Brady, and I continue to say, despite having the rare privilege to be exposed to some of the greatest minds on the topic that exist in the world, case in point, um, is that, you know, uh, some of this stuff just isn't so difficult. That some of it, the more and more you go into this pursuit, the more clear it becomes.
Yeah. Who would have thought that treating individuals with kindness and respect would cause them to relax and like you and then behave better? Who would have thought that?
Yeah, anyone who just steps back and
Yeah.
goes, wait a second, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, so that's been a big piece of it. And I just feel really blessed because it's like the most exciting time in history to be part of this
Yeah.
movement, to be part of learning how to teach animals.
So where did you go after that? What happened then?
Um, After Brady, so I started with positive training. And then I transformed our relationship. And so that sort of posited me that created interest in doing the shelter work that I talked about. And I think some of the work I did with Brady was what really informed that work, was like, oh, I've been with dogs who are really dangerous, so I got this. Um, and I did start working with them, and I still was balanced. I still did not quite understand that no dogs need that. I still had it in my head that like, oh, this is Brady. Brady needs this
Yeah.
reward only, but not this working line. They really move into pressure or whatever my belief was. And so I discovered that I felt the limit of the shelter's guidance. Like I was working with the highest level volunteers, and I was still uncertain when I was working with a dog. And the result, like I was charged with these conditions that was like, this dog needs to pass the SAFER exam, which is
Yeah.
like a stress test, yeah. Um, or we're putting them to sleep. Like that
Yeah.
was it. And you had kennel attendants who like took it personally. They would tell you, they would like be really inflamed. That dog needs to learn how to da da da, or I'm putting them down. And it's like, okay, I got it. And so inside of that, I knew that the results of my work that week and the next week would determine the outcome of this dog's life. So I really wanted to make sure I was working with the best information. And so I started apprenticing under a really well-known trainer in Southern Oregon,
Okay.
who he's a really fantastic man. And he's accomplished a lot in the world of IGP. And he's a balance trainer. And everything he does, he has I call him uniquely abled. Most people call him disabled,
Yeah.
because he only has the use of about 20% of his body, and he trains all his dogs from a wheelchair using mostly his mouth.
Okay.
And so his adaptation and his flexibility in setups
Sure.
it's still some of the most remarkable uh, setups that I've ever considered, because he doesn't have the function of his body like the rest of us do. Um, and so I learned a lot about that. And I thought that I was getting somewhere, and I was getting somewhere. I was getting a lot of places. Um, and I did notice that there were limitations. I noticed that there were, sometimes people would take in dogs to be evaluated by him, and they would be, livestock guardians who would aggress against a stranger or something like that if they came in the house. Imagine that.
Yeah.
And he would create these setups and see like if the dog had the capacity for aggression. And when they did, really the responses that I saw were like good counsel on keeping the public and themselves safe, which was
Okay.
prudent, right?
Yeah.
He's like, hey, you got to watch out for lawsuits, you got to watch out for bites, you got to protect this animal, you got to manage them. Um, but I saw how the addition of punishment or the absence of access to reinforcement or the absence of the ability to escape did not work, that it had these really firm limitations. And that was in spite of what they could do with some of these dogs. I mean, some of the dogs that they use this system with perform some of the most amazing things that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And speaking personally in training them, this is like 12 years, 15 years ago now. But they seemed pretty happy. They were into it. I didn't see a shutdown dog, and I was around shutdown dogs, despite the fact that I couldn't read animal behavior as well as I can now. But it didn't strike me that these dogs were unhappy.
See,
Um,
with that, just what's interesting about that, and this is why I rarely talk about this, because we have the ability in long form content to expand into this a little bit, you know. But what then happens is people take a 30-second clip and say that's what they are saying, and you're like, oh, there's lots of context to this. And I don't know if you remember reading Jackie Chan's autobiography.
no, I haven't.
And
Not Jackie Chan.
he was saying that when they changed the welfare standard for circus performers, child circus performers, because that's what he was, you know. So that's
Oh,
where
okay.
he got his break into showbiz. So he was a one of the big. I don't know if it's a national circus, and I don't even know if he's from Hong Kong. Forgive me for the detail, but it was. He said that the practices that they were subjected to were abusive,
Yeah.
you know, as children, right? He says that, you know, can't do the splits properly. That's fine. You'll get a cane taken to your glutes until you can, or push down into the splits. Now, what he said was that he compares, and it was not. He wasn't saying it wasn't with regret and saying that we should be doing it the old way. He says that the the children now, the child performers now aren't as good as they were, right? And I said, yeah, but
Mhm.
that's the way I was looking at it, is that's not the point. The point isn't that performance. He says it's what we get 10 years later, 15 or 20 years later, with rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, you know, your anger management issues, all these things. Now, if just and it reminded me of what you said there when you said you don't see these dogs being shut down. I'm sure if you saw these kids, you would see them behaving like kids. They're
Yep.
happy, they're playing, you know. But that's not it. You have to look at the whole picture,
Absolutely.
not just that. Oh, the dog looks happy. But that's it's not really the point, is it? You know,
Yeah, exactly.
you know.
Yeah, no, and having said that, part of that is that, yeah, I didn't really know how to look at a holistic picture, first of all. And I also didn't know how to integrate the realities that those dogs get into fights when they're on the field.
Yeah.
That injuries from trials were regular
Oh
occurrences.
wow. Okay.
That some of these really highly trained dogs came back from trials. I would say at least every other month, a dog was injured during a trial because of a dog-dog aggression.
Yeah.
Um, so that was very much in keeping with it.
On there is what's going on there. That so I always say that the outlet for there's a price to somebody has to pay the piper. You know,
Yes,
if an individual is subjected to harsh treatment, there's
yes.
payment has to be made at somewhere along the line. So it's either
Okay.
externally. So if we're abused by life, you either externalize it and you're angry at the world and you shout and you honk your horn and you get into fights and you're squaring and you're on it, you know, everything enrages you. Or you internalize it and then we end up getting autoimmune disease, stroke,
Yep.
cancer,
Yep.
depression, blah, blah, blah. So what you're probably identifying there, which you'll know, but it's just for people who are listening to it, those fights that happen in the trial field, that's the outward backlash from the dog over that being subjected to those training methods.
Absolutely. Those training methods 100% of the time chip away at resilience,
Yeah.
period. That is 100% of the time the truth. And the other observation that I had, which I sort of like thought that this was like, oh, this is a better way to do it, is that the dogs they selected were tolerant to this input. They
Yeah.
specifically bred dogs to be shocked,
Yeah.
to have stress tolerance, to be resilient to that level of punishment and fear. Um, Also, they would many of them, this was another thing that this is one of the reasons I was like, oh, you're so great. They would work a dog for a year or two and then retire them.
Yeah.
So they would pour their hearts into these dogs, working and training at an incredible level every day for years. And then they would get to a point, maybe they were at IGP2 and they needed to get to 3. And the dog just could not take the levels of intensity of the consequences that they
Yeah.
created in as an effort to realize this outcome behavior.
Yeah.
And they'd retire them. And I was like, see, if they don't, if they can't deal with it, they retire them. That's such a more ethical way to do it. And now I kind of see it as like, don't you think there's something wrong with the approach if you can't use it on
Yeah.
even most of the dogs that you
Yeah.
work with, that
Yeah.
that most of them, and and this continues to be a feature of this person today, where it's like he brings them up into this point and then, oh, my dog doesn't like tracking, I've tried P negative on this and it's not working, and I've tried P positive and I just can't get him, stim is on unless his nose is on the ground. Stim comes off when his nose is on the ground, but he still doesn't want to track, so I'm
Yeah.
retiring him. It's like, no kidding.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right that there isn't any way out of this energetic feeling input output loop.
Yeah.
That if you put discomfort in, they have to do something with it, and they're either going to internally process it and it's going to be expressed as disease or other sorts of health conditions, or behaviorally, or both.
Yeah.
That's just what science and research has showed us over and over and over again, and that's across mammals.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
unique to us or to dogs or rats or whales or.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you listen to the episode with Cliff? From it was one when we started again. Cliff. Cliff's going to shoot me because I can't remember his surname. Canadian Cliff. And
No,
he does
I
search
didn't
and
hear that one
rescue
yet.
with these German Shepherds, and he says that so it'll be interesting. You'll like that episode because he talks about training without conflict,
Yep.
and the problem that he was having was to get the uses the ball as a reinforcer for tracking, and she wouldn't give up the ball at the end of the track, right?
Go figure. Yeah.
Until she got back into the car, and as soon as she got back into the car, settled down, she would drop the ball and could come back out for another track, no problem, right? But he had tried all of these things of how to get the ball back from her and blah blah blah. But he was introducing conflict into the training process, and she
Of
stopped
course.
the life. She then started enjoying the tracking less and less and less, just for what you've said there. It just becomes this is weird now.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. And these conflicting contingencies are known to do that. Like
yeah,
this ABA is very clear about this stuff. So when we create conflicting contingencies that you get this once you do something you don't want to do, it's coercive by its definition. And so in that way, even using, and not training without conflict, but if you're using a reinforcer, you still have to be aware of the dog's emotional state, because depending on their motivation to that reinforcer, the act may be coercive and it still may reduce resilience in that space, because they want the ball or they want the food or they want the motivator. They don't want the thing they need to get to it, but they do it anyway, and that
yeah,
still reduces resilience.
yeah.
So I've noticed that
So
a lot
expand
of.
on that. Expand on that a little bit. So,
Yeah,
or what you're saying is the dog doesn't particularly enjoy doing the behavior that is attached to the reinforcer, but they'll do that behavior anyway.
exactly, yes. There's conditions like that where, even as positive trainers, even focused on reward-centered learning, um, if we create a condition where access to the reward is available only through a particular behavioral outcome, then you're still denied
Yeah,
access to the reward for all the other behaviors that you produce. So
yeah,
in that way, it's still potentially coercive. And depending on the dog's personality and their feelings about the event, You may be creating frustration tolerance, stress tolerance. You may be creating impulse control, self-control. You may be creating desensitization. You may be counter conditioning. But if you don't take the time to say, what does this dog want to do? What do they
Yeah.
like? What are their what through their unconditioned behaviors and their natural expressions when left to their own accord, what do they do? If you don't take that information into consideration and try to provide behaviors that they like, at least initially. If you need them to do a behavior that's not comfortable for them, you have to get them there gradually in little pieces. The desensitization analogy that I like to use, and you might need to desensitize your dog to a positive behavior like eating, as an
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
They might not feel comfortable eating, and eating as a behavior, not as a reinforcer, is a different input. Um, but if you can graduate the dog into the desensitization model, where it's like, if you want to learn how to eat whatever, a Reaper pepper, start with a peppercorn, a black peppercorn, eat that for a week, then gradually increase the level of spiciness, and your body adapts to it. It no longer tastes the
This is for us.
spiciness.
Get cut out a little bit there. It's
Yeah,
just so that
yeah.
people aren't thinking you're suggesting you're feeding your dog peppercorns.
No,
Talking
no.
about, yeah, right. It
Sorry
just
about
no,
that.
no, it's okay. No, just cut out a little bit. So yeah, so what you're saying there is, if you want to desensitize yourself to spicy food, you start
Yes.
at the lowest level of spice and gradually increase that.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
You
no,
do
it's
not
okay.
do that with your dog. Um,
Yeah,
but for instance, if in the same analogy, if the spicy food for the human is a watching a dog without barking, as
yeah,
an example, that's the thing that's really hard for them to tolerate. You need to start at a behavior and a condition that isn't as hard to tolerate, where you can actually affect the motivation and the emotional valence about the behavior.
so
Um,
expand on that a little bit. Tell us more about that.
yeah, so there's this thing called the Mendel graph, where he graphs emotional valences. And it's a model to explain how emotions work. It's a way that we can understand emotions, which is really complex. And the model has two different spectrums. One of them is high arousal, the other one is low arousal. So are we excited or are we feeling calm?
Yep,
And then the other one is the emotional valence, which means, do we experience this as appetitive or positive? We enjoy this, we're seeking reward. Or do we experience this as punishing? We want to avoid it, we want to escape it.
yeah,
And emotions exist all over that. So you can have really high energy excitement, you can have real high energy fear and avoidance, or receive abuse is an
yeah,
example of that. And they exist in all the different spaces. And so, for instance, you could have a dog who is willing to perform a low arousal behavior, meaning that it looks kind of calm, but it has a negative emotional valence associated with it, meaning they
yeah,
don't particularly like it.
yeah,
A good example is, like, if your dog has any sort of arthritis, he might not enjoy sitting. That might
yeah,
be uncomfortable for him, but he might do it for a treat for sure. But
yeah,
that's an example of that. And you can choose behaviors like that create the same function and have a different emotional association. So maybe you need the stillness, and so you can choose a stand,
yeah,
and the dog performs the same utility behavior. In other words, the behavior provides the same benefit to the training situation, but they experience it from a different emotional quality.
yeah,
They experience it appetitively or positively. And and that's extremely important, um, because prior to being able to understand dogs' cognitive functions with the technology that science has evolved, and we were strictly using observational, we weren't really able to know that as clearly. And that directly determines what the protocol you're using, what characteristic it
yeah,
is assigned to. So you are not doing counter conditioning, you are not doing desensitization, you are not doing self-control or stimulus control. Some people call that impulse control. I like to call it
yeah,
stim control. Um, you're not doing any of those things if the emotional valence is not positive, most likely.
Yeah,
You might be doing other things. Those other things might be helpful. It's not
yeah,
to say they're without benefit, but to know what we're teaching is a critical component of gaining outcomes and getting results. We have to know what we're teaching and when we're teaching it, and that's a fluid and or that can be a fluid and dynamic experience.
I tried to illustrate that a few years ago. So we've got our little dog looks like she looks like a Kelpie. People think that I mean
Mhm.
she's nearly 11 now, and people think she's a German Shepherd puppy, other than she's getting a little bit grey around her mouth. But she's that kind of
Uh,
size. She looks like a kind of 20-week-old German Shepherd, you know. Now
gosh.
she's got um she's got longer hair around her rump and less hair on her belly. Now she
Hmm.
will sit down on wet concrete but won't lie down on it. And she will
Hmm.
lie down on wet grass but won't sit down on it. And the reason for that is if she sits down on the wet grass, it soaks up into her hair and she's walking around with a wet butt. But if she sits down on the wet concrete, the hair cushions the
Mm.
right. And I know this because now if so I don't ask her to lie down on wet concrete because it's too cold on her belly. And so she'll sit on that. And I won't ask her to sit down on wet grass but she'll happily lie down on that, you know. So it's those two, it's examples of that. And the way
Yes.
I look at it is if you ask your dog to do something that they know that it's been so well practiced, you know, and they don't immediately respond, or there's a hesitation, and it only has to be half a second, quarter of a
Yes.
second,
Yes.
and they're telling you something.
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons, I really am a fan in evaluation of free work, ACE
Yeah.
free work, Sarah Fisher. Um, there's so much that can be gleaned off of the animals, the underlying conditions and motivations. And, we are huge advocates of learn your dog. Train the dog in front of you is kind of another colloquialism, but learn your dog. Um, a similar thing that often I explain to people from an emotional standpoint, that's a great example of an operant standpoint, is some dogs, when it comes to fear, they like to watch their triggers. They feel more in control and safer when
Mhm.
they can observe it. Other dogs don't want to look at it. It's too overwhelming. Which
Yeah.
is your dog? I don't know. We have to do
Yeah.
setups. We have to create behaviors. We have to create treatment plans that inform different choices in a comfortable environment where they can feel safe and do this. And then we have to test that, and we have to have strong observational skills and have various resources that we know have good rehearsal history, as you're describing. So we know that they're well practiced. We have a picture of what does it look like when you do this behavior when you're comfortable? What does it look like when you do this behavior in the presence of a trigger? And what's the difference?
Yeah.
And that's a critical component. And that really opens up, I find, for some clients that they can relate to that. It's like, do you want to get the heck away from that trigger as fast as possible or feel like you're getting away from it by interrupting your observational gaze? Or do you want to look at it? Because who knows what would happen if you didn't look at it, kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's just a personality driven
Yep.
experience. And many clients can understand how, if they're not going through the steps to be able to answer that question, the same way you went through the steps to be able to go, why don't you want to lie down here or sit there, and could figure it out, they they don't understand why their dog's performing the behaviors they are. And they
Yeah.
also don't understand why the training that they're doing isn't working, because
Yeah.
they're doing the response that the thing said to do when the dog does this. But
Yeah.
all of that is without consideration of who the dog and who the handler is. So,
So things that common faults, or yeah, we'll call them faults. Common faults that people might make are and we've all got these kind of buzzwords and expressions that our clients use, and it immediately you go, oh my
yeah.
God. Right. You know, so and lots of this is cultural. So the ones that do it for me are trying to distract the dog with food, right? So that
Yeah.
and I get it. It's cultural. It's so ingrained in us that they think that's what we're doing, and you're like, that's not what we're doing. And I spent 20 minutes explaining to you that that's not what I was doing. So trying to distract the dog with food. And the other one was make the dog sit, or I get the
Yep.
dog to sit. So when we read these protocols online, when you see a dog coming, ask your or get your dog to sit and give them a treat.
Yeah,
Right now, there that I don't want to sit because I'm now immobile if that dog comes in, and two, the food's not important to me anyway because that dog's threatening. But
yeah,
if we've got these prescriptions that we're then trying to shoehorn ourselves and our dogs into this, and it's significantly more nuanced than that.
absolutely it is. It is significantly more nuanced. And kind of circling back around to the beginning of the conversation, it is accessible. You can just look from, is it working for me?
Yeah,
And that's one of the things that I often tell people um, when they, here in the US, there is such a there's such a disparity between, the different ideas of animal learning. And there's quite a bit of vitriol, there's quite a bit of irritation and really
yeah,
anger, which is wild to me. But when people come and ask me like, well, why don't you use these tools? Um, the conversation is really like about risk and benefit. It's really
mhm,
about risk and benefit, and it's about efficiency. So I let them know, like, I'm trying to use the most beneficial inputs that carry the lowest degree of risk. And I am aware that some dogs experience much more intense adversity at a and don't realize the potential risk that is possible, that has happened. We just don't know if it's going to happen until we do it. So
yeah,
as
yeah,
clinicians, we sort of well, we very much have an ethical responsibility to analyze in every given input what's the potential harm, what's the potential benefit.
yeah,
And that's what the answer is to what should I use? What's the
yeah,
potential harm? What's the potential benefit? And with that analysis, all spectrums of learning exist. They just have a different analyzed quality about them. Some
yeah,
are much more risky with much lower potential for benefit. Others are much lower risk with much higher potential for benefit.
yeah,
Um, and so I like to first off explain that. And then I like to tell them that any approach that you're using should impact behavior in the moment and should reduce the unwanted behaviors over time. So it should reduce the organic production of those. Hold
yeah,
that standard
yeah,
for any approach you're using. If the dog is not experiencing, if you're not experiencing the ability to redirect a behavior in the moment when it's happening, as well as an overall reduction week over week in the number of instances of that behavior, you're the problem. The
yeah,
human is the slow learner, not the dog. The approach is flawed.
yeah,
And we can use that, and we can use behavior as a diagnostic to understand that. We don't need to analyze it. We could just look
yeah,
at the behavior. The behavior is the diagnostic.
yeah,
Um, and if you add those two things in, there's always a risk reward analysis, and you should be achieving in the moment results and week over week improvements. Whatever elements are being used that accommodate both of those are the right ones. And as it turns out, when you put a grid on it, when you put an analytical lens on the input that you're using, it doesn't preclude, it doesn't say you shouldn't use shock. It says you should look at shock and consider what are the potential risks
yeah,
and what are the potential benefits. And are there other ways to achieve those benefits without those risks?
yeah,
Um, and very much there is. We
yeah, yeah,
absolutely 100% know that.
yeah,
Anyone who's telling you differently is telling you from their knowledge set. It doesn't
yeah,
mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean they haven't witnessed those outcomes, but it does mean that we don't need to use those tools. We 100% don't need to. And I was just talking with a client about this last night. If you call your doctor with a headache, they might prescribe a glass of water, which has almost no potential for risk and very little potential for improving your headache, but some, maybe you're dehydrated.
yeah,
The
yeah,
next thing they might do is say, go ahead and take a Tylenol. There
yeah,
is a higher potential for risk because people have had medical harm from taking a
yeah,
Tylenol, but it's extremely unusual and it's extremely effective. So there's an example of a risk reward that a doctor might recommend or a clinician might recommend. And then the last one would be like, cut off your head,
yeah,
because like that definitely will cure your headache.
yeah,
But it certainly it has a high degree of risk. And if you apply that lens to this conversation that people are having, to me, it really kind of cuts through the BS. It's
Yeah,
not about what's right.
yeah,
Um, it's about what's effective and what you're comfortable doing, you know. And then there's the whole conversation about ethics, which is important, but it's completely parallel. It's completely separate from the risk reward and efficiency conversation. And it turns out that all three of those, the ethics, the risk reward, and the efficiency, they all point to one
yeah, yeah,
inclusive system of learning,
yeah,
which is characterized as it happens to be by kindness. It happens to be kindness.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It becomes the evolutionarily most beneficial characteristic of humans in their dog relationships. And wouldn't you know it, for dogs, for domesticated canine, it's survival of the friendliest. It's not
yeah,
the most dominant in feral dogs. We're not talking about wild dogs. That's an entire species. We're talking about feral domesticated dogs. It's 100% in all the research. It's survival of the friendliest, not the most dominant,
yeah.
not the most possessive of resource.
And it's interesting, and there's a lot there that I could further expand. I'm just conscious of time. Um, the when it came up with the Darwin, that survival of the fittest, it doesn't mean the strongest, most powerful person or individual. It just means the person that is fittest to be able to adapt to the environment that they find themselves in. So you've got those dogs that are friendly and tame, but that's how the dog we domesticated them in the first place. It was the friendly ones that came closer and closer and closer to the settlements and all the rest of it. So it's not about us being powerful and dominant over our dogs. And when you look at how many times there was a guy, I'll not mention his name. He took umbrage with something I'd said on Facebook a few years ago, which is, I mean,
Mm.
that happens regularly with me anyway, because my personality. So um, now he was working with a dog at the time who was similar to my dog, similar to Logan.
Mm.
And the dog ended up putting him, he used a prong collar and a shock collar on his dog. The dog ended up putting him in hospital severely
Hmm.
and got put to sleep,
Hmm.
right? And Logan, that didn't happen to Logan.
Hmm.
So same behaviors, similar types of dogs,
Yep.
and he was abusive towards his dog. So in that instance there, I am fitter for that scenario than he is, you know,
Yes,
because I survived and my dog survived. He didn't survive the incident, not really, and his dog didn't survive at all, you know.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about adaptation. It's about what's the most adaptive behavior here, not what's the strongest, what's the most powerful, the most domineering, and all of that. That's
And
really, yeah.
then a couple of things just wanted to expand on. You're saying, so you've got um the it affects behavior in the moment, and then overall we see a reduction in unwanted behaviors. So
That's
if
it.
you look at the Tylenol example, if you are taking Tylenol every day for your headache, then it is affecting it in the moment, but you're not seeing. So you then have to get further investigation into that. Yeah.
That's it. That's
Now,
it. It's not about the immediate consequence alone.
then we've got that example for our dogs. So we use the reward-based training. If you've got the ability to change behavior in the moment through reward training, but you're using the same amount of rewards 5 weeks later or the week later, then
Yeah,
something wrong with your protocol.
yeah.
You know,
It also, if the behavior is not reducing in its frequency,
yeah, yeah. And then the same way is with punitive based training. So if trainers are using the same amount of collar corrections, the same amount of shocks on their dog, the same amount of verbal corrections or physically taking dog space. But the feedback loop for us is that it's working in that moment, which is why we keep doing it.
that's
Yeah.
it. It's Dr. Sophia Yin. She said like it's not just about the consequences. You cannot look at the immediate consequence as a basis for understanding if the input is efficient. Taking it back to the trials, the working dogs in IGP and IPO. Um, you know, some of those dogs who got into fights that landed them in the vet the same day also were titled that day.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
also achieved very high scores that
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
So they were performing
Yeah.
at remarkable levels. Oh my gosh, remarkable levels, but they can't navigate the common elements because they can't reduce that frequency. And that's where
Yeah.
all of that approach always falls apart. Like
Yeah.
it just always has a consequence for that.
Do you watch the UFC?
I do. Yeah.
Right. So that example there, that's the difference between Conor McGregor and George St. Pierre,
Okay.
isn't
Excellent,
it?
excellent analogy.
Right. So Conor McGregor, they both perform brilliantly, but George St. Pierre is a stable individual, and Conor McGregor is not.
Yes.
Like,
Yep. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And you know, and like I said, there's enough that goes on in the human learning that needs to be addressed. Um, because, you know, which is actually starting to happen now. There's actually like I'm seeing in the social media and in sort of the common knowledge. Here's what it looks like when a dog is healing and is terrified.
Yeah.
Here's what it looks like when a dog is obedient and shut down.
Yeah.
Here's what it looks like for a dog who's loading aggression but following commands.
Yeah.
Um, some of that visibility is now being pushed out there because so much of the folly, the error that I see humans making is, as you pointed out, oh, my dog's up to no good again. I better go do the correction thing and do the input or the reward thing. I
Yeah.
better go do the thing that gets them to stop doing that until the next time that they do it again, in which case I repeat myself like a lunatic.
Yeah.
And then we want to call that learning, or worse yet, we want to fault the dog for being stupid because I've
Yeah.
showed you this 300 times and you still don't get it. You must be dumb,
Yeah.
right? And this is the irony of all ironies, right? It's like the dog is perfect. The dog is already doing what works for them. I promise you.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So we went down, and I'm not complaining at all because it's been an interesting conversation. Um, we were going to talk about how to bring shelter dogs out of shelter environment into, which is fine, okay. But we can stock on our. You got another 10 or 15 minutes?
yes, absolutely. I have plenty
Yeah.
of time.
Okay. So, we take some of these dogs who are stressed. We bring them out of shelter environment, and they've been in for X amount of days, weeks, or months. And depending on the shelter that they are in, it can be truly excellent or really, really, really stressful. Regardless of that, it's stressful anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. So what can we do if you've just adopted a dog that's one of these dogs in order to help them get on the path towards being settled, calm, a good companion and all the things that we want?
Yeah, great question. It's probably one of the most important questions, and I would say the first thing to do is set your expectations up
Okay.
reasonably. Okay. All of these dogs, you can just assume it's not true for all of them. Some of them are really, really resilient. But all of these dogs have been exposed to trauma or less than ideal conditions, 100%. And even the ones who have developed non-violent coping mechanisms,
Yeah.
so they don't express with unwanted behaviors and so forth, their resilience is always being chipped away because they have such limited agency. They have so little choice in the shelter, and they're so regularly exposed to experiences that they wish they could stop,
Yeah.
be it the smells, sounds, inputs, walks, food, whatever it might be. And so the first thing is to understand that it's going to take some time for for you to know who your dog is. And there's this parable, the rule of three, which has its flaws, but it does have its benefits. I've recently seen some people coming out very strongly against it, which I kind of am a little bit concerned about. The rule of three states that it takes 3 days for the dog to decompress, 3 weeks for them to learn the patterns of your life, and 3 weeks for them to establish their patterns inside of your life, or 3 months rather.
3 months. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. Now, this is not an exact
Yeah.
schedule. And I think that's inferred. I think that the average human knows that the dog doesn't wake up on day 4 and go, okay, time to learn your patterns. Um, and that there's flexibility amongst those categories. However, I think it does help people to have some expectation of when I first bring my dog home, for the inaugural days, maybe it's 3 days, maybe it's 7 days, I'm not going to be able to tell anything about their behavior or make any inferences about who they are. That's the first thing to know. And the second thing is, well, what can I do to support them? Do less. Give them a quiet space that is predictable, that is small, that has all of the things they need, and that's close to you.
Yeah.
Kind of like a puppy almost,
Yeah. Yeah.
insofar as that sort of like support system. And know that taking them out of the shelter is such an advantage that you don't need to take them on hikes. You don't need to take them to the beach. You don't need to get them groomed. You don't need
Yeah.
to give them a bath. All of those things, which I really want everybody to do with their dog, um, are going to be much more well received in the future. And
Yeah.
that the first thing to do is know that you are giving them such a leg up in the world, such an improvement to their experience by giving them quiet,
Yeah.
a place with quiet,
Yeah.
okay? A place where there is a person who is interested in interacting with them, maybe at least once an hour or 2 hours,
Yeah.
right? When humans interact with their dog a lot more frequently than that is the point. Um, and can experience new things safely. And
Yeah.
that's the third thing that's up to you, is you've got to make sure that their experience, the quality of their experiences in their new life is very safe and very predictable. And if you go to the beach or something else, it might be really fun, but it's not likely to be safe and predictable. And before they've figured out who you are, what the qualities of your relationship are, how you interact, how they can meet your needs,
Yeah.
okay, until that happens, and then of course until you discover how to meet their needs, and that mutual relationship, that mutual feedback loop is at least somewhat established, which I think takes about, on average, maybe a month.
Yeah.
The best thing to do is to keep their world small, keep the expectations low, keep their enrichment very high, lots and lots of fun, rewardable experiences that take place inside of your home or inside of very familiar areas like your backyard or something like that. And have that expectation that the first step is, I just want you to decompress. And then the first thing I'm going to teach you is how to feel safe with
Yeah.
me in here.
And what gets in the way of that, I think, is that people, they've got the, my dog needs a walk, my dog needs to get outside, but they don't realize that these are not normal dogs at this stage. They're not normal
Yes,
dogs. They're just out of
yes,
prison. And I don't want to equate prison to shelter, but there are lots of similarities, you know.
yeah,
But, and I'm not saying that, because people that work in shelters, I mean, they're truly amazing. The work that they had, the heartache that they go through.
it's
But
all a selfish endeavor. I assure you, it's all
no,
just
yeah,
selfish. We
yeah,
love it. Those dogs are amazing.
yeah. So, but it's just the they don't need all of the things that
That's
your
it.
Labrador, when you had grown up, needs at that moment. In a
That's
year's
it.
time, maybe 6 months' time, maybe. You know,
Yes. But yeah, that's they don't need those things, which is great. That's convenient. Don't
yeah,
worry, they will have great needs that will put you at large inconveniences if you allow it in the
yeah.
future. Um, so setting up expectations, keeping the world small, that's another big suggestion. Keep their world small.
What
Start
does
with
that mean?
little. It means don't take them to a lot of new environments.
Yeah,
Get them familiar with a comfortable and safe place. One of the characteristics that we can prescribe to all of these dogs is they haven't had a consistent place that they can decompress and feel safe
yeah,
in.
yeah.
That's one of the consistent characteristics that 100% of them have experienced. They have had transition and ownership. And that consistent life experience creates a very high probability of particular life lessons. Um, and so part of the thing that you can do first is to say, don't worry, for the next 3 to 6 weeks, I'm going to focus on showing you that I'm here in your life. I'm here to keep you safe. And everywhere in my house and in the areas that we're going to occupy most of the time is the blessed places that you want to be. And
Yeah.
the sights, sounds, and smells and activities of the events that go on in my house are all okay. Um, and and it's going to take you some months to determine that. Um, one of the things that I often see, kind of skipping ahead here, is after, and this is why it is a rule of three. It's a right around that 3 week period, in a significant number of the cases, that we see a dog who starts to be really happy and soliciting lots of affection and affiliative behaviors, and is starting to open up.
Mm-hmm.
And the human is kind of being like, oh, they're being a regular dog. But then they call and say, they're starting to be really reactive around strangers. They're
Yeah.
starting to, right? So, and this is an expression of the dog starting to feel comfortable in their own location,
Yeah.
potentially,
Yeah.
and wanting to defend it because now they have a safe territory and they
Yeah.
finally have some decompression and some predictability and some agency, trust, security, and they don't want to lose it. And their life has taught them that these resources might be temporary.
Yeah.
And so I often tell people, like, if you see a spike in reactivity around what looks like protective behaviors, people are, oh, he wants to protect me. Oh,
Yeah.
maybe. Um,
Yeah.
that's a good sign that your dog is starting to feel more comfortable in their environment. And that's a good time to maybe start adding in some lessons and some skills, just
Yeah.
some basic skills about, what sometimes people call obedience.
Yeah.
Skills that help our dogs understand our cues that allow them to navigate the world with our support initially and then without it. So
We've got
just kind
some.
of having that yeah,
No, you go, on you go.
I was just going to say having the expectation that somewhere between the time you get them and about 6 weeks, many dogs will start displaying with what looks like protective behaviors, and it's a great piece of information.
Yeah.
It tells us our dogs are feeling safe, trust, predictability, and security. And what do you know? We can start adding in some skills-based learning, some emotional conditioning, some request response reinforcement paradigm interactions. Like we can start asking them to do things for rewards and so forth as a mechanism of addressing those emotional conditions.
We get similar things in that in our own experience. There's a couple of examples that spring to mind. You join a new team at work. So especially when you're younger, as you get older and you're used to transitioning, you might take a leadership role when you go into a new team or whatever, but even there, it's still there. You go into a new team and that team's already established. So you keep your mouth shut for the first 2 or 3 weeks until you get the lay of the land. And people might be able to push you around a little bit at that time. And then after the 2 or 3 weeks, and you start finding your feet, people say things to you and you say, hey, you can't talk to me like that. So that's the reactivity in quotes, you know. Or we had I try not to mention my jiu-jitsu school in every podcast episode, but there's lots of parallels with dog behavior, especially dog play in BJJ. With that, one of the guys, his cousin came in to train with us a few weeks ago, and John has been training for 10 years. Our school's only been up and running for 2 years. I've been training for 14, something like that. And the guy's really capable, big, fit guy, strong, with lots of skill. And I was speaking to him afterwards, and he says, I was still nervous about coming in here. I says, of course you were. You don't know any of us. He says, now, we're not a bunch of animals. You go to some places and they try and kill you as soon as you go in the door because you're the new guy. I says, but you don't know that coming in here, So we've all got these things, and we're living in a human world, and our dogs are coming in and living in a human world, and they're a dog.
Yeah.
So these things they're completely natural that these happen.
Absolutely. It's brilliant analogy. Absolutely brilliant analogy.
So what happens after you've got between the kind of 3 week and the 3 month mark, that rough guide, what goes on there?
That's so in that point, that part of the process is where the dog is starting to establish rituals that they utilize to navigate the day-to-day experiences. So they're going to start having expectations. They're going to, oh, well, we get up around this time and then we go for a walk or food or whatever. So they're going to have some of these expectations, and then they're going to start performing rituals. So every time I go out and touch the leash, I start jumping about, right? That's an example of a ritual. And that's also where you're going to be able to learn your dog more clearly, because they'll be willing and trusting enough to show you about how they feel about things at that point. So that's a good time, after that first period where they kind of have their patterns, they've established your patterns. and you're noticing this kind of confidence and the safety, that's when it's really important to start learning who your dog is and learning, maybe asking yourself the question, how did this dog get into a shelter population? I
Yeah.
wonder what about their personality landed them here. And some of them, there's no answer. They're just
Yeah.
perfect dogs. They're
Yeah.
super biddable. They're really
Yeah.
sweet. They don't have a mean bone in their body, and they just, they
Yeah.
got the
Just through
raw end of human.
circumstances. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
But many of them you can see. You can see, oh, you have a little over arousal, or oh, you're an adolescent. That's a big one.
Yeah.
The shelters are just stocked with adolescent dogs.
Yeah.
Um, and from that, and this is not, you don't have to be a dog trainer to do this. Behavior is the diagnostic. The behaviors you like, you can reinforce so that they continue. The
Yeah.
behaviors you don't like are the communications from your dog that there is something about that circumstance that they are uncomfortable around, and the behavior is the coping mechanism.
So that's the jumping, mouth and grabbing the leash, humping,
That's
goofing
that's
off, not paying attention.
that's it. You
You
don't
know.
want to suppress those. Otherwise, how would you know how they're
Yeah.
feeling?
Yeah.
So that's that's that conversation about distraction versus redirection. But yeah, when they're doing the nuisance behaviors, whatever you discover those to be,
Super important, isn't it? To recognize that. It's so crucial.
absolutely. It's so, and that was a paradigm shifting moment
Yeah.
when I began to understand, oh no, you don't want to start directly impacting the behavior with operant or counter conditioning protocols.
Yeah.
Because let's say you're successful, God forbid, right? And then
Yeah.
the dog changes the emotional valence. You don't have the diagnostic anymore
Yeah.
about what environmentally is
Yeah.
precipitating that behavior.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm going to pause you there a second because I
yeah,
want people, if see if you're listening to this, can you
yeah,
rewind this? Can you rewind the last 2 minutes and listen to it again? It's so, so, so important. Just rewind 2 minutes, listen to that bit again. And then if you get to this part again, can you go back and do it again? It's so, so, so important. Logan would bark at me, the same thing. He would bark at me to tell you, Dad, this is difficult for me. He would see a dog or somebody would speak to him in the street and he would turn around and look at me and start barking. And I go, I know, okay, cool. You're telling me that you're overwhelmed here. Let's do something about that.
that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Our behavior is their communication. It is our diagnostic, our most powerful one. If you don't have an fMRI machine in your house and
Yeah.
you can't perform positron emission topography and you're not ready to do saliva swabs and fecal swabs and blood draws, then all you got is the behavior, because those
Yeah.
are the other tools that we use to understand how they're feeling.
Yeah.
So, and that's what can happen in that 3 month period, is starting to understand, where are you uncomfortable? And not so much, why are you uncomfortable? Specifically, as humans, I discover that we often are like, what's the trigger? What is it? All we have to do is find the trigger, and then we have to desensitize it, and then we have to find the next one and desensitize that one, and then the next one and the next one. Meanwhile, the dog is adding to that list. So this would
Yeah.
be a never-ending pursuit, right?
Yeah.
Much easier to look about, what are the qualities of this condition that are likely affecting you? Is it, there's novelty? Is there a lot of motion? Is there no predictability? There are
Yeah.
certain qualities that we could accurately assign to a condition that our dog is reacting to, and we can work on those. And
Yeah.
when we say, for instance, it's novelty, you live with 3 dogs, you don't have a problem with dogs, you can get along with dogs. But if you see a dog on leash, you have a problem with it, right?
Yeah.
Well, then we can work on novelty. We can work on novelty, and we don't have to work on novelty using novel dogs. We can
Yeah.
work on novelty using a novel, benign object like a cone or
Yeah.
something they've never seen
Yeah.
before, what have you. And it's during that time where you really want to be slowly starting to expand your dog's world by changing the environments that you're with, change with them in. So start taking them to walks and trails and beaches and to the vet and do some of those things. And then be a really keen observer of your dog's behavior and listen to what the behavior is telling you, and start to, before you start addressing it or trying to suppress it or trying to reduce it, start looking at what it is and make a list of, hey, you know what? This is what's happening. I was so surprised today. when we took you out and all of a sudden you exploded when you saw a squirrel. You've never done that before in all 4 months that we've been together.
Yeah.
And start looking from those things and start trying to understand who your dog is and learn your dog.
Yeah.
And from the behavior, if you watch it closely enough, the behavior will tell you how to change it. So in that example, if you like squirrels, probably you like chasing.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
probably like to chase things. So that gives us some information about saying, I'm not going to ask you to sit and take a treat when you see a squirrel because you would hate that,
Yeah.
right? Most likely.
Yeah.
But I might invite you into a better game of chase
Yeah.
to make and then get information from that, right? And maybe you want to play my game of chase and maybe you don't, but I get information from that and I'm starting to understand from a pathological perspective through the dog's personality what I might be offering as a reward that is actually rewardable, that is actually something that the dog has a shift in their emotional valence. It suddenly becomes from negative or neutral or uncertain to, oh boy, I like this.
Yeah.
And now I'm onto a reward strategy that's effective. Um, and that is a very important part of it. What's the effective reward strategy, right?
Yeah.
And that the answer to that question is likely contained in the observations you have of your dog in that 3 month period.
Yeah.
That's why I love those you have trainers who use coercive techniques or suppressive techniques, prongs and chokes, and they'll show you, hey, look, I've got a bacon wrapped filet mignon in my hand, and my dog won't listen to me even though I'm calling him.
Yeah.
And for me, that's just saying, wow, you really don't understand reward
Oh, I
strategy.
know. I know.
Boy, you really just don't understand motivation.
Yeah.
And so without just because you keep upping the value of the food and it's not working, you're just using one facet, just one characteristic of food rewards
Yeah.
inside that picture. So in many ways, you're just like you're advertising how little you understand
Absolutely. Yeah.
animal
I know.
learning.
I know.
Um,
I know.
and so that's where observing your dog and learning about the things they're concerned or reactive around, their reactivity as an expression of their feeling, and learning what are some of the characteristics of those triggers or events that you are responding to. And once I have that, either as the owner or maybe you hire a professional, if I took an evaluation where somebody said, I've been observing my dog for the past 3 months, and what I noticed is that in these 5 contexts, when motion or objects that predict motion are present, my dog becomes more tense. It starts with rigid, right? If I could get that kind of insight, I could
Right.
probably tell people exactly what to do in 2 sessions
Yeah.
and create transformative outcomes.
And
Um,
that's our skill as as an investigator to
yes,
get that information from the client. Um,
that's it.
and I mean, some people will be aware, and others will not. But
Yeah.
you know,
And that's why I'm suggesting watch your dog's behavior. Try to learn from it instead of control it or judge it.
yeah,
Stop judging what's happening. Just receive it as this is information. And you know, control it by meeting needs. Like I said, when I do behavior plans, at least, especially when it comes to dogs with high risk behaviors, which I have many of, um, probably the last thing that I do is look for a protocol to address the unwanted behavior directly,
yeah,
because that unwanted behavior is the diagnostic for me. So if
yeah,
I can meet their needs genetically, improve the safety of their environment, improve their ability to complete the stress cycle, add stress, add trust, add agency, and we notice that the unwanted behaviors are being reduced, we're onto something.
yeah,
And if we don't, we before we go, oh well, we better go address the behavior. We need to figure out what's going on in that dog's life that we're not seeing an improvement in the unwanted behaviors by meeting needs. And it's not to say that we don't use counter conditioning, desensitization, frustration tolerance, stimulus control. We use all of that stuff, but from the priority
yeah,
of understanding behavior as the diagnostic, and more importantly, from the priority of developing resilience and impacting the parasympathetic nervous system specifically. So, like we do operant conditioning, but only from the priority of improving the dog's ability to cope with stressful situations and recover from them. So
Perfect. This has been one, and we could easily talk for another hour, but that's usually how these things go anyway.
yeah.
Anything that you want to say? I'll catch once we finish recording. I want to have a chat with you just for another couple of minutes. But anything you want to say before we finish up?
I've just been a big fan of your work, and you've been a personal inspiration to
Oh,
me. You
that's
led me
kind.
all the way to Edinburgh, when I was like, wow, these people here, they're so much more advanced than we are here in the States. They're so far past the conversation. So I just really want to offer my gratitude for your firm commitment. From your halty head collar video from all that time ago
When I had my
uh,
shaved head, no
when you
beard.
had your shaved head and your dark beard. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was a big piece. So it's a real privilege for me to
Oh,
come
that's
full
kind.
circle and
Thank
be
you.
on your podcast. And thank
That's
you
not
for
what I was asking you to to say, but I'll take
oh,
that.
you gave me the opening. You said anything else you want to say. Well, I couldn't let the podcast go without offering some appreciation for
No,
who
I
you
really
are in the
appreciate.
world.
Thank you. And I'll stick to I'll stick where people can find you in the show notes. So if people want to look up your socials and stuff, all right, we'll put all that down there. Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
You bet.